so embarrassing to see. You know, I was sitting at the Intercontinental last night, which is a hotel around the corner, where I was actually at a press conference sitting 4 meters in front of Zelensky last week, and it was filled with US diplomats, British embassy staff, people with their heads in their hands all night. It was a mood I've never quite seen in my life. And that's because United States diplomats are highly embarrassed by the behavior of their president, not by Zelensky. That's how people feel here. This is the worst breakdown in diplomacy I think that Europe has seen. You know, this in the first time in 80 years. Europe can't rely on America anymore. During the largest war in Europe since World War II, during the largest invasion. So it's absolutely disgraceful. And
in your analysis, Gerard, how did this descend into this extraordinary slanging match in the Oval Office?
Well, I think you have to understand the context here, which is obviously that the aim for President Trump was to try to get this deal signed, this minerals deal signed, which he thought he kind of pretty well had in the bag. And to be fair, it's a very much a one-sided deal. It would have given the United States access to Ukraine's mineral resources without really any kind of undertaking in return. Now, Trump would say, well, that was because this was intended as a sort of a repayment in part for all of the money and aid that the United States has given Ukraine over the last few years. But obviously, from Zelensky's point of view, he wanted something a little more than that. If the United States is going to kind of reap the benefit of exploiting minerals in Ukraine, he wanted some sort of indication, since this is part of supposedly of a peace settlement, he wanted some indication that the United States was going to offer some sort of a security guarantee and contribute in some way to Ukraine's longer term security in the event of a ceasefire. So that was the backdrop. It was always a very fragile negotiating position that both sides really had, and I think that was very much what was on Zelensky's mind. And so when this is a very these what are they called? They call them pool sprays. Washington, when cameras move in and they basically are just supposed to take a photo op with maybe a couple of questions. Instead, it turned into this lengthy debate, most of which, to be fair, kind of started off reasonably calmly. I do think things took a bad turn when J.D. Vance, the vice president, decided to sort of really up the ante, and both to sort of needle Zelensky about diplomacy and about his own position. And I think Vance was trying to impress Trump with his kind of loyalty and being sort of more Catholic than the Pope, as it were, with Trump. So I think you have to understand that it came in the context of a fragile negotiation, which had been tentatively agreed but was by no means sealed, and then this very, very public, lengthy discussion, which was, as they sort of spiced up by the vice president in particular, deciding that he kind of wanted to really demonstrate, his kind of MAGA bona fides, and it went downhill very, very, very rapidly from there.
Is it possible to answer this? It strikes me that this was unprecedented. Was it premeditated?
It's a good question. There's a lot of debate about that, Callum, here, and I've seen both sides of the argument. I don't think it was. If you watch the whole lengthy, it was about a 40-minute sequence. The first half an hour of it is the president and both presidents actually answering questions, from the assembled reporters. It's reasonably civil. Trump is kind of on pretty good behavior. There's a bit of back and forth. So it didn't feel that way. And by the way, one would not expect those pool sprays, as they're called, to go on for very long. So, if this had been staged, you would think that Vance or Trump would kind of get in much quicker with their, with the knives out, as it were. But the knives didn't come out until very, very late in the process. So I'm skeptical of that idea. I just think, again, I really do think it came down to J.D. Vance deciding that, to kind of up his own reputation, to impress Donald Trump, knowing that Donald Trump doesn't. By the way, the deeper backdrop to this is that Donald Trump doesn't like Vladimir Zelensky. He knows that his sort of MAGA base is not very enthusiastic about Vladimir Zelensky. So with that context, and look, I do also think. I mean, again, I put most of the responsibility here on the president and the vice president, but I think it's that some of the criticism that's been made of Zelensky is probably justified as well. When you're in that situation with Trump, you kind of do what Keir Starmer did, on Thursday, where you smile and say nice things, and you don't really get into a really sort of fierce back and forth. And as much sympathy as I have with Zelensky, given the extraordinary situation he's been in and the extraordinary courage he's shown, he probably should have just bitten his tongue, let that exchange take place when the cameras were off and behind closed doors. But no, I don't think it was premeditated. I don't think it was planned. I think it came about, as I say, because of that kind of rising background of tension and the various political interests of the parties involved, which led them to that unfortunate altercation.
And so we come to where we are now, because Zelensky arguably finds himself squeezed between the leaders of Russia and the US, who, on the face of it, seem to agree more with each other than with him. And add to that the kind of European leaders who have rallied to the support of Zelensky and Ukraine. I mean, not all of them explicitly calling out President Trump, it has to be said, but certainly demonstrating support for President Zelensky. And so I'm trying to position the kind of key players in all of this in my own mind, because with Trump's comments comes praise from people like Dmitry Medvedev of the Russian government. This idea that Trump's worldview, that global affairs are directed by this kind of handful of strong men leaders from around the world, which puts him in the same basket as Vladimir Putin. Where we end up in terms of progress towards peace, it feels certainly right now like that progress has been completely and utterly derailed.
Yes, it does. And look, Callum, I've talked about this before. I do think the fundamental reality here is that, as basic as it sounds and as kind of disturbing as it sounds, and it is disturbing, Donald Trump just prefers Vladimir Putin and Russia, both in terms of the man himself and the country that he represents, the relationship that he somehow thinks the United States can have with Russia. He prefers Vladimir Putin in Russia, not only to Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, for whatever reason. There are some personal stuff with Trump and Ukraine that goes back, and Zelensky that goes back to to his first impeachment, not only with Ukraine, but he prefers it to the relationship. He prefers Russia to any relationship he has with Europe, with the possible exception of good King Charles and the United Kingdom. He doesn't like the European Union. He doesn't like most of its leaders. He doesn't like what it stands for. He likes Russia. And, that's just, again, now, whether that is, again, we've talked about this before, that whether that is to do with, some sophisticated conception of great power diplomacy and the new world we live in, which is no longer the liberal order, it's determined by the great powers, or whether it's just a kind of fundamentally instinctive feeling on Trump's part that he's kind of more comfortable with people like Putin. We'll have to see. But I think that's where we are. So yeah, I think that in terms of the diplomacy, look, who knows what will happen? It was very clear that Zelensky wasn't going to do what some people were urging him to do after the event today, go on Fox News and apologize. He wasn't going to do that. He refused, which seems now to be the condition for Trump sort of reopening any kind of a dialogue with Ukraine. He's not going to do that. He's got his own people and I completely understand that. He's got his own country to represent and to stand up for his own people. The Europeans, as you say, have rallied round very, very explicitly, with a sort of slightly notable exception of the UK, which was sort of trying to perform still a more balancing act. But I think there is a fundamental breach here. I don't think there's any question. We have a president who just doesn't really believe in the transatlantic alliance, which has been the cornerstone of US security for 80 years, and he's just doesn't buy it. It's not to do any more with the Europeans not doing enough to contribute to collective defense. It's not to do with even with shifting priorities towards the Asia Pacific in Trump's mind. It's just he just doesn't really feel any affinity with or for the European Union, the European pillar of the transatlantic alliance, and he does feel a kind of an affinity and a proximity with Vladimir Putin. I think that is, now I'm not necessarily saying this means an irrevocable breach immediately in the alliance. There will be desperate efforts going on right now, by diplomats on both sides to sort of try and repair some of this damage. But that is the fundamental reality that in the end we're not going to be able to escape.
Gerard Baker there, editor-at-large for the Wall Street Journal. Well, from Washington to Kyiv, let's speak to Caolan Robertson, who's a journalist in the Ukrainian capital. Caolan, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It's really good to speak to you. I suppose then, just by way of considering what happened in the Oval Office yesterday, there was something of an ambush by the President and the Vice President, it would seem. But is this kind of telling? Does it demonstrate that Zelensky hasn't quite mastered the art of diplomacy with President Trump, that he requires some handling?
No, I think the behavior by Trump and Vance yesterday was bullying. It was abusive. And to blame Zelensky is insanity. I mean, what Zelensky has been through for the last number of years in this country is the unthinkable. And any breakdown in diplomacy yesterday happened because of Trump's behavior and the ambush against Zelensky. This was all basically pre-set up. It was ended, obviously, with Trump saying that it made great television. And I don't think Trump had any attempt or any willing to actually have any kind of peace deal or to sign anything yesterday. This was clearly premeditated in the way that they asked Zelensky those questions and the way that they started provoking him. This was basically an ambush, and it played straight into the Kremlin's handbook. And it's so embarrassing to see. I was sitting at the Intercontinental last night, which is a hotel around the corner, where I was actually at a press conference sitting 4 meters in front of Zelensky last week, and it was filled with US diplomats, British embassy staff, people with their heads in their hands all night. It was a mood I've never quite seen in my life. And that's because United States diplomats are highly embarrassed by the behavior of their president, not by Zelensky. That's how people feel here. This is the worst breakdown in diplomacy I think that Europe has seen. This in the first time in 80 years, Europe can't rely on America anymore. During the largest war in Europe since World War II, during the largest invasion. So it's absolutely disgraceful. And there is rhetoric coming out right now saying, oh, Zelensky should have handled this better. Zelensky should have done this and that. Well, actually, there's nothing he could have done because this was set up in advance before his plane landed in DC.
So that's fascinating. So tell us a little bit more about where you were last night. Who was? You don't need to name names, of course, but you're saying that there are diplomats who are frustrated at Trump's approach to all of this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, where I was last night, the Intercontinental Hotel, this is kind of the main gathering hangout spot for journalists and staff from the different embassies. And people were glued to their phones all evening in shock. People were extremely emotional. Because this came out of absolutely nowhere, but it was a mood and a feeling I have never felt before in this country. And I've been visiting here for the last 2 years. I've lived here for the last year, and specifically U.S. diplomats who were disgusted with the behavior of their president. And actually, some of the stuff I overheard were people saying that they kind of felt embarrassed being American in Ukraine right now, walking around the streets. And, they felt even bad, looking at the staff. There were these sort of awkward looks with the Ukrainian staff. I mean, my goodness. But I don't blame them. I mean, that's how I would feel if I had a U.S. diplomatic passport right now, because there are no diplomatic relationships anymore. They broke down last night, and that's because Trump and J.D. Vance broke them down.
Yeah.
And it's only them to blame.
Yeah, I think that is a fascinating insight into reaction in Kyiv. Just very quickly, Caolan, I wanted to ask, because Kyiv has been bombed again overnight, I think.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I live here right in the center of Kyiv, and this is happening every single night. Again, because Vladimir Putin doesn't want anything to do with peace. The peace conversations that he has are a complete lie, because he's been sending drones and missiles into the capital here every single day. There's your diplomacy from Russia, which is basically the same as the US right now, which is non-existent.
Caolan, thank you very much. Really fascinating speaking to you. That's Caolan Robertson reporting from Kyiv.